Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And we are talking about Saito Kohei, or Kohei Saito as I often call him, examining his edited volume, Examining Engels' Legacy in the 21st Century, which we're not reading the whole thing, we're only reading an essay. And the specific essay is essay number 6 by Saito himself in chapter 6, Metabolism, Crisis, and Elasticity. Before I go into this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kohei Saito. He's currently the associate professor at the University of Tokyo. He's a Japanese philosopher, educated both at the Wesleyan University in Connecticut and the Free University of Berlin, and then completing his doctorate at Humboldt University of Berlin. His claim to fame was Nature versus Capital in 2016, and Marx's Ecology and the Unfinished Critique of Capitalism, which I think is also, which I have as a different title. I have it as Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Marx's Ecology, and the Unfinished Critique of Capitalism. He is most famous today for his 2020 book, Capital and the Anthropocene. I think his work is interesting, although I have to say that while I find a lot of the research in Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, that book, which has about 15 different names, as I've read today, I don't love all of his extrapolations from scholarly work. He also edited this volume, which is in the Marx, Engels, and Marxisms series from Palgrave Macmillan, which has a bunch of interesting stuff in it by like Tarcell Carver and other people attached to the Mega. And he edited volume 18 of the Mega 2. So he is a Mega scholar. For those of you who don't know, the Mega is the largest scholarly and critical collection of the Marx Engels work that exist. All right. We're going to be reading his essay in this book on Engels, which is not particularly long. It was translated, I believe, by Saito himself and Liz Susenbach. Anyway, let's read this. The tense relationship between Engels and Western Marxism is well known and has a long history of heated debates in the Marxian study. Footnote that we will check out here. This tension, I was just talking about the translation. He's referring to the way that is going as far back as Lukacs. There was a tendency to kind of downplay Engels indefinitely in the New Left in both Germany and the United States, and to a lesser degree England, tended to see Engels as leaning towards what would become Soviet-style Marxism and kind of Paul as a corrupter to Marxist Jesus, a narrative I don't completely buy, but I also don't buy the Engels and Marx are entirely the same. My position is somewhere close to the Engels and Marx agree on most things, but they're not the same person, and their thoughts do have to be somewhat disaggregated, even when they endorsed each other. And sort of the position of Tarcell Carver as well. Anyway, back to this text. The tension famously originates from Lukacs' History and Class Consciousness, in which he criticizes Engels' inappropriate expansion of the Marxist dialectics into the sphere of nature. Foreign talking. Yeah, I tend to agree that Engels goes too far to kind of turn um, Marxian dialectics into a kind of total theory, particularly in anti-Loring and dialectics of nature. But that I also think too much has been made of this. I think Tarcell Carver's work on Engels says that, and Marx indicates that Marx didn't totally endorse Engels, but he never corrected him. So we can't take Marx as really disagreeing strongly with what Engels did. Anyway, back here. However, it is much less known that the late Lukács seemed to change his attitude towards Engels' dialectic. I knew that, although that's generally attributed to to Lukács' softening towards Soviet Marxism, particularly after 1952. And he rather incorporated Engels' discussion of labor as a key element to grasp the quantitative jump from nature to society. That's the discussion of labor as a mover of evolution and dialectics of nature. This is where I'm talking, just to tell you where it comes from. This is an important theoretical shift, which can properly understood only when one carefully looks at Lukács' theory of metabolism, which goes back to his unpublished manuscript of 1925-1926, entitled Taylism and the Dialectic, which is a very interesting book, by the way. As a result, the deepening of his theory of metabolism, the late Lukács loosened his critique of Engels and other unpublished a manuscript, The Ontology of Social Being, which I've talked about in an interview but haven't gone deep into because I don't think I've read all of it. Anyway, back to Saito. However, this shift does not mean that Lukács admitted that his insight claim made in History and Class Consciousness was utterly false and no longer worth examining. One can even argue that his late theory of metabolism is consistent and continuous development of his earlier view in History and Class Consciousness. Derek speaking here. I would say that there is actually something to be said for people overstating the difference between Engels and Marx, but also people overstating the difference between young Lukács and old Lukács. I think there is a continuity there. The History and Class Consciousness Lukács and Destruction of Reason Lukács are not totally devoid of each other. Anyway, nevertheless, at least one thing has significantly changed in his late writings as a result of his conception of Engels. Lukács briefly elaborated in his theory of crisis in the 1920s based on his theory of metabolism, but this is precisely what disappears in the Ontology of Social Being, the late unpublished work. This is where I'm talking again. The big problem that Lukács, like other Marxists, confronted at the time was rather an unexpected reality that the economic crisis did not lead to the collapse of capitalism. Asterisk, this is where I'm talking again. You will notice how much this comes up in discussing the transition of Marxism from the 1920s to the 1940s, where people thought that the final crisis was going to drive a revolution automatically, or near automatically. That does not happen. And this is shared by Western and Eastern Marxism. It's kind of across the board. It is only after 1948 and that crisis doesn't happen by the early 50s that people completely drop it. And in the 40s, it becomes kind of a big problem. All right. This is because of capital's elasticity and productive forces, which allow capital to undercome various contradictions and to shift them to somewhere else. I love how Saito puts elasticity and productive forces into quotation marks because, like me, he sees those as terms that are both over-determined, i.e. there's more than one thing going into them, and kind of weaselly. Interestingly, elasticity, that's in quotation marks, and the productive forces of capital, that's also in quotation marks, are exactly what Marx himself emphasized in the 1850s and 1860s, i.e. when Marx seems to drop his initial belief in immiserationism as forcing a revolution, which is what he seems to have indicated in his letters in the 1850s, while Engels underestimates their theoretical and practical importance. This is because Engels maintained his earlier view of historical materialism developed in the 1840s, according to which the motor history is rooted in the development of productive forces. In this sense, there is a clear difference between Marx and Engels. Asterisk. I want to hold my breath on Saito actually proving that. Late Lukasz's endorsements of Engels' dialectic of nature was only possible by suppressing the difference between Marx and Engels in regards to capital's elasticity and productive forces, and thus abandoning his earlier theory of crisis. And that's Lukasz's earlier theory of crisis, not Marx or Engels. All right. The birth of Western Marxism and Lukasz's critique of Engels. One of the main characteristics of, quote, Western Marxism, unquote, that's in the text, is to highlight the difference between Engels and Marx in an attempt to save Marx from the flawed theoretical consequences of Soviet Marxism. He cites here, Saito cites here Russell Jacoby, Western Marxism, the Dictionary of Marxist Thought by Tom Bottomore, Oxford Blackwell, 1983, page 580. That's a good book, by the way. If you ever get the Tom Bottomore Dictionary of Marxist Thought, it's very useful. And Russell Jacoby's work, I've had my issues with it. I love Dialectic of Defeat, but I also don't think it's perfect, particularly the closer it gets to modern times. Nonetheless, let's really dig into this. Although the expression Western Marxism originates from Merleau-Ponty's Adventures in the Dialectic, published in English in 1973. I don't know which. Its basic idea can be traced further back to Lukasz's History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923. Challenging the dogmas of Orthodox Marxism, asterisk, which Orthodox Marxism is unclear if it's Second International or Third International when we're talking about 1923, as in the Comintern has only existed for like 4 years at this point. In attempting to explore the true legacy of Marxist social philosophy as a critique of political economy, Lukács emphasizes the difference between Marx and Engels. In a famous footnote to History and Class Consciousness, Lukács argued for the need to strictly limit the dialectical method so only to the analysis of society, criticizing Engels' unjustified expansion of the dialectical method to nature, which can be regarded as a cause for the fallacies of Orthodox Marxism. Block quote. This is from History and Class Consciousness. It is of first importance to realize that the method is limited here to the realm of history and society. The misunderstanding that arises from Engels' account of dialectics can, in the main, be put down to the fact that Engels, following Hegel's mistaken lead, extended the method to apply to knowledge of nature. However, the crucial determinants of the dialectic, the interaction of the subject and the object, the unity of theory and practice, the historical change in the reality underlying the categories as root cause of changes in thought, etc., are absent from our knowledge of nature. Back to Saito. Though carefully hidden in a footnote, Lukács's claim turned out to be too provocative at the time. It immediately gained attention, resulting in harsh criticisms from traditional Marxists. Both Soviet and Second International hated it. Although my friend Amok Sahu actually says that this text and this claim right here is actually what forms Marxism as opposed to historical materialism as a worldview. I don't know if I agree with that, but I have my other problems with Lukács. There's 1,000 things I used to blame on Lukács, some of which I still blame on Lukács, even though I find him an interesting thinker. In this passage, Lukács distinguishes between two different methods of sciences, i.e., one for the social analysis and the other for the natural science. His point is clear. One must not confuse the two methods in scientific investigation. According to Lukács, Marx actually only employed his dialectical method as a critique of political economy or as a critique of capitalist society. In other words, Marx's dialectical methods had only to do with the realm of society. Yet, so said Lukács, Engels' in the Dialectics of Nature and the Anti-Düring illegitimately extended Marx's dialectic to the realm of nature as if there were no difference between the two realms. Warren talking, that is the claim, and it was maintained pretty much up through a lot of the Frankfurt School into New Left Marxism, both in the English-speaking world and in the German-speaking world. I don't quite understand its influence in the French-speaking world. If anyone knows, feel free to comment in the show notes or tell me in the Patreon. All right. In other words, Marx's dialectical method has only to do with the realm of society. Yet, so said Lukacs, Engels in his Dialectics of Nature and Anti-Dueling illegitimately extended Marx's dialectic to the realm of nature as if there were no difference between the two realms. Asterisk Foreign Talking. Tarcell Carver talks about this in his Engels, A Short Introduction, where he says that Marx doesn't ever fully endorse this view, but he also never distances himself from it. And so, what do we mean he never fully endorses it? Even in the letters where Marx talks to Engels about this, he's kind of cagey. Um, and it really doesn't seem to show up in Marx's work. However, um, Marx doesn't ever like correct it or say anything to distance himself from it. You have to kind of juggle what you think that means. There's no clear hermeneutical answer to how you interpret that kind of silence, particularly when there's so much that Marx and Engels share. And the bad Engels, good Marx story kind of really does limit your ability to understand how much Marx and Engels really do share. All right, back to text. In Lukács' view, a serious problem emerges out of this misimplication. If the dialectics as such can be found and established through the investigation of nature, Marxists can first focus on natural science in order to bring back a sophisticated dialectical method, and then bring it back to the analysis of the capitalist society. However, its consequences was, so said Lukács, the deterministic and positivist understanding of society and human history modeled after the method of natural sciences, the tendency of which was already clearly discernible the case in Soviet Marxism. Lukács found such a tendency quite dangerous, so instead he attempted to avoid its fatal consequences by strictly limiting the dialectics to the realm of the social. However, this limitation of dialectical method can become one of the main characteristics of Western Marxism. Asterisk. This is why I'm speaking. What this means is that Lukács is afraid that the positivistic claims of this Marxism as if it is a natural science actually does lead to Marxism being falsifiable pretty quickly because its predictions may not happen, in which case its normative claims are also unvalidated. Whereas in the realm of the social, where there's more room for voluntary action and less room for positive claims, this is more of a critique of positivism. There is a reason to think that there's more room for movement and adjustment in history and less disprovability of the central claims of Marxism. Now, I've talked to Amok Sahu in an interview about the problems of this and how it becomes circular, but I do think this is an interesting thing that Lukács is trying to avoid. Back to the Saito text. One, obviously, such a criticism of Orthodox Marxism can inevitably cause various harsh associations with Lukács' history and class consciousness. One example can be found in Ladislav Rudas, who was an influential Marxist-Leninist philosopher in the Hungarian Communist Party. According to Rudas, Lukács' rigid separation of the social to the natural inevitably failed in a crude dualism, which is incompatible with Marxist materialism. Rudas, right? If the dialectic is restricted to society, then two worlds exist, with two quite different sets of laws, nature and society. In natural phenomena are undialectical. In society, they are dialectical. Fine. All great philosophers have been monist, but this does not mean that they were right. According to Lukács, the world is dualist. I have to say, there's some real bad Marxist-Leninist philosophy, and it's interesting that with Rudas delving down on all great philosophers being monist, given that Lenin's scientific imperial criticism is aimed at monism. Anyway, suddenly Lukács faced various criticisms, and later Marxists were also eager to point out the theoretical ambivalences and inconsistencies. Asterisk. I also agree there's a lot of ambivalences and seeming inconsistencies in Lukács and weirdnesses and totalities. But anyway, back to the point. In this context, if one reads the second edition of History and Class Consciousness, which was published in 1967, one might simply think that Lukács admitted the problematic character of his own assertion made in the 1920s. In the edition of 1967, he added a long, self-critical preface. You should read it. It's fun talking. Which seems to confirm his theoretical shifts. Indeed, Lukács significantly changed over time after facing a number of theoretical and practical and political criticisms. In the new preface, he even regretted the fact that his treatment of nature as a social category strengthened, quote, the tendency of Marxism, the tendency to view Marxism exclusively as a theory of society, as a social philosophy, and to ignore or repudiate it as a theory of nature. Lukács admitted that this consequence was because the fact that the central category of Marxism, i.e., labor, was missing from history and caste consciousness. Quote, the purview of economics is narrowed down to the basic Marxist category, labor as a mediator of the metabolism between society and nature as mediating, unquote. Eliminating the categories of labor and metabolism, Lukács thought he ended up losing his way to comprehend the relationship between society and nature, so that his theory fell into a dualist worldview. Even after this self-criticism, though, that's in quotation marks, by Lukács, there remained opposition between those who emphasized the difference between Marx and Engels and those who emphasized the theoretical continuity between them. See Tarcell Carver, Marx and Engels, the intellectual relationship. See Saito, Marx and Engels, the intellectual relationship, revisited from the ecological perspective. See Marcel Musso, Marx's Capital After 150 Years. It's a book I have but have not dug into yet. John Stanley, Mainlining Marx, and John Melanie Foster and Paul Burkett, Marx and the Earth, an Anti-Critique. There's a lot of things to read there. I've read a few of those, but not all of them. All right. However, in this context, it is noteworthy that John Manley Foster did not simply dismiss Lukács' discussion as a false one. Rather, Foster points to Lukács' uses of the concept of metabolism in his manuscript from the 1920s entitled Taylism and the Dialectic, which was written as a defense of history and class consciousness, an asterisk only recently published in the last 15 years. An asterisk. Foster argues that this, quote, critical shift in Lukács' understanding via Marx's conception of the social and ecological metabolism had already been largely reached at that time. An asterisk, that time being the 1920s. Well, that's a quotation. This insight is important because, in contrast to the preface of 1967, Lukács does not actually dismiss the category of labor even in the 1920s. Furthermore, Lukács continued to work on the concept of metabolism in the following years, in which the concept of labor plays a central role. In his unfinished final work, The Ontology of Social Being, which was published only after his death, he elaborated further on his theory of metabolism. Focus on metabolism, as Foster highlights, consistent with Marx's own approach. See Bellamy Foster's Marxist Ecology, which is a book everybody should read if you're into eco-socialism, and Marxology. Don't agree with everything John Bellamy Foster said, but it's an important work. Instead of simply opposing society and nature, Marx analyzed their dynamic interaction between society and nature mediated by labor. Thus, in an easily understandable why the concept of metabolism is quite essential for Lukács in his attempt to defend history and class consciousness from Ruda's critique of dualism. If we began to comprehend the incessant interaction between society and nature as part of a universal and ecological process, it becomes immediately clear that one cannot completely separate the two realms, as the footnotes seem to indicate. A different approach is required in order to understand what late Lukács intended to develop in his project, The Ontology of Social Being. Surprisingly, Engels' discussion of labor plays an important role here. And we're going to stop here. But I hope I've whetted your appetite to weird Lukácsology, Engelsology, and Marxology to try and understand how complicated interpreting these texts are. And when you get simple explications of like Western Marxism versus Soviet Marxism, you're often getting an overly simplified view of what is going on, of which Saito is good at illustrating. Now, Saito is sometimes guilty of what I like to call basing your entire interpretation of Marx off of the back of a napkin Marx wrote something down on one time. AKA basing your stuff off of notes and letters that are unpublished based off published manuscripts, thus trying to reinterpret published material that was signed off by Marx by unpublished material that may not have even made it into manuscript form. But nonetheless, Saito is an astute reader of Marx, Engels, and Lukács, and a bunch of other people, and he knows his shit. I don't doubt that. I think sometimes he might be over extrapolating, as sometimes people who study the Mega 2 are often want to do. But he's still a great scholar, and we're going to come back to this essay very soon.